Hello, my name is Tania Mitchell. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Post-Secondary Teaching and Learning in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. I'd like to start by thanking John Saltmarsh and Elaine Ward for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I look forward to hearing more about your conversations on these critical issues following the colloquium. I've been asked to speak on the critical issue of structures of inclusion. And I've been thinking quite a bit since I received this invitation about what exactly we mean by structures of inclusion. And I have a similar dilemma with this framing as I do to conversations we have about social justice. What I mean by that is that it is often difficult for people to talk about what social justice is or what social justice looks like without naming the injustices that must or should be redressed in order for justice to be realized. In other words, social justice continues to be defined as what it isn't, as the absence of injustice, rather than as a developed vision for a truly just world. So I'm struggling a little bit. How do we talk about structures of inclusion and community-engaged scholarship without talking about the structures that exclude? How do we have these conversations without being honest about the discrimination, the exploitation, the oppression and inequality that are so very fundamental to the social issues we're concerned with? How do we talk about or develop strategies for a more inclusive community engagement practice without naming and addressing the barriers to community engagement that exist? And the barriers to community engagement are many. I only have about 10 minutes, so I can't possibly outline all of the barriers that I imagine, that I experience, that I see and hear about, but there are a few that are very much on my mind and that I wanted to talk about today. The first is that corporations and foundations are having more and more influence on what strategies to address community problems look like, as community organizations and nonprofits become more dependent on their support to do good work. Community work is now seen as part of the market economy. Many have called this the neoliberal problem, the privileging of economic liberty above all else, and this is translated into a corporate and foundation interests that are able to direct the ways community organizations address problems at the center of their work. Note that I said address and not solve, because one consequence of the neoliberal influence has been that the initiatives designed to respond to social concerns are typically surface level. They're feel-good projects, rather than work that attacks problems at their roots. So for example, we're seeing an increase in teen homelessness as organizations are funded to provide after-school programming or mentorship programs, but forced to close overnight shelters because they can't raise the funds to support safe housing for young people. And further, in order to retain the funding that they do get, organizations are restricted from engaging in lobbying efforts that might advocate for a change to Section 8 policy so that young people might qualify regardless of their student status. This example, and so many others, keep us from engaging in work that might really transform systems and structures of exclusion. A second barrier is a community engagement strategy that is more reliant on numbers of hours than on meaningful community work. My current research project involves curating syllabi of service learning courses from colleges and universities all over the United States. In reviewing these syllabi, while there are notable exceptions, I have been surprised by how many campuses still classify engagement by the number of hours a student volunteers in a placement, rather than looking at the quality of the work occurring, the impacts and implications of those efforts, or the possibility for sustainable change on the central issue or problem at focus of the community work. This approach to engagement does not consider how the structure might exclude more progressive community work that may not have a 501c3 classification, or that may not have the staffing or infrastructure to monitor volunteer hours. This approach to engagement does not consider how a strict placement option might limit participation for students who work full-time, or those who have family responsibilities at home, those who are athletes or might otherwise have barriers to participation. It continues to astound me that community engagement options are often least accessible to the students our communities most need to see taking an active role. And further, there are now several for-profit systems in place that higher education institutions are encouraged to buy into that track those hours and then translate them into dollars or other useful metrics that we use to market our good work to external constituencies. And meanwhile, the social conditions that create the need for service in the first place remain unchanged. A third barrier that we have yet to fully remedy is the history of our institutions in the communities where we reside. A history of displacement and gentrification and redevelopment that too often left, and sometimes still leaves, the community our engagement practices aim to benefit behind. It's a history of the community as a research laboratory, rather than partners, or better yet, leaders in change efforts. It's a history of our campuses ignoring the knowledge, experience, and expertise of the community. And yet we're still surprised when the community doesn't trust us. The final barrier that I feel is important to name is the significant concentration of community-engaged work that is dependent on women, on people of color, and particularly on adjunct and contingent faculty. As we should all be aware, community-engaged work takes more time. And because it takes more time, that labor is less financially valuable than pedagogical and research strategies that we know are less impactful. Is this a structure of exclusion? Absolutely. For an already frequently marginalized segment of our campus populations to gravitate toward a pedagogy that requires more effort, that can be viewed as a distraction from the more traditional expectations of faculty, and that is too often neither recognized nor rewarded as an expression of scholarship, perpetuates a structural injustice that we haven't even really begun to explore. The implications of these patterns and structures of exclusion are an acceptance of and promotion of the status quo. It's a complacency that leads us to feel that what is and has been is at best just fine, and at worst transformative. That we've convinced ourselves that we are doing enough to address the critical social issues that impact our communities. Now, I'm not saying that community-engaged work isn't powerful, and I'm not saying that it isn't meaningful. But it would serve us well to consider with more intention who serves, who is served, who benefits, and who is and is not changed through our community engagement efforts. It would serve us well to be more transparent about the systemic injustices that undergird so many of the issues we attempt to address through community-engaged work, and to recognize that those injustices may also be very real in the lives of the students we teach, in the lives of the activists we partner with, and in our own lives. It would serve us well to name the structures of exclusion and inequality, and how those structures lead our efforts toward inclusion to be limited, to be tokenizing, to sometimes be reductive, and to almost always be ineffective. If we fail to do this, we run the risk of simply adding to the injustices that already exist, while speaking the rhetoric of community engagement and social justice. Can we begin to visualize the structures of inclusion in community engagement when we have not yet addressed the structures that exclude? As I reflect on this issue, I'm challenged by a few questions that I hope lead me to be a better scholar and practitioner of community engagement. The first question is, am I partnering with people, agencies, and organizations that are working for systemic change? And do their practices, both in hiring and action, reflect those aims? How does my work, or the work of my students, advance their mission? The second question asks, How does my work engage those who have been systematically excluded? Am I being attentive to those concerns and conditions that have kept them excluded? And how am I working in ways that support their inclusion? Finally, what does an inclusive community engagement practice look like? Who else is thinking about these issues? And how can I work alongside them to work to implement this vision? I believe that an effort to build a more inclusive community engagement practice is a critical issue that must be an intentional focus of our work moving forward. I am so glad that this is a topic of conversation for today's colloquium, and I hope to work with many of you going forward toward this ideal. Thank you very much.